Hello, and welcome back to the British Accent Podcast. I'm Nick.
And I'm Emily. We're so glad you've joined us again. Today's episode might make you think a little differently about your words, not just the words you choose, but the language you use to tell your story.
Yeah. Today we're talking about something that language learners often experience but don't always talk about: why telling the same story in two different languages can feel completely different.
It's something I've felt myself, and I've heard so many learners say it too. You translate a memory, a thought, a part of your life into English, and suddenly, it doesn't feel quite the same as when you say it in your native language.
And it's not just about the vocabulary, is it? It's something deeper. Something emotional. It's like the tone of the memory shifts. Maybe it feels softer in one language, or heavier in another.
Exactly. Sometimes it's even hard to explain why. You might be telling someone about something painful that happened years ago, and in your first language, it brings back this full wave of feeling. But then you try to explain it in English, and somehow, there's distance.
And for some people, that distance can feel helpful. Like the emotion becomes more manageable in English. A bit like watching the scene through a window rather than standing in it.
Yes. I've heard people say they could finally talk about something in English that they could never say in their native language, because the emotions would have been too strong, or too tangled.
It's fascinating. It's like English becomes a kind of emotional filter. It doesn't erase the feeling, but it gives you enough space to hold it, to look at it from a safer place.
But then, the opposite can happen too. Some people find English more intense, especially when they've had big life experiences connected to the language. Like if you moved abroad, or fell in love, or had your heart broken, in English.
True. Sometimes a word hits harder in your second language because of how you learned it, not in a textbook, but in real life. Through real experiences.
Like, maybe someone said something to you in English that stayed with you forever. And now, that word carries an emotional weight that it just doesn't have in your first language.
And then when you try to retell that story in your native language, it feels flatter. Or maybe even a bit wrong.
That's the strange beauty of being bilingual or multilingual. You realize that language and emotion aren't just connected, they're woven together. You don't just translate words, you translate feelings, culture, even identity.
And not everything survives that translation, does it? Some words feel too formal. Some don't exist at all. And sometimes, the emotional rhythm of one language just doesn't land the same in another.
Right? Like when you say, "I miss you" in English, it feels simple, direct, clear. But maybe in your native language, the phrase is longer, more poetic, or carries a deeper cultural meaning.
Or maybe it's the other way around. Maybe your language has 5 different ways to say, "I miss you," and English has just one. That can be frustrating too.
But it also opens up space to redefine your story. You might find that, in English, you can be more honest. Or more playful. Or more brave.
And that might change not just how you tell your story, but how you feel about it. That's powerful.
And I think what's interesting is how many people don't realize it's happening. They'll say, "I feel like I'm a different person in English," or, "It's easier to talk about certain things in this language," but they can't quite explain why.
Yeah. Because we often think of language as just a tool. But it's not just about communication, it's about identity. It shapes how we see ourselves, how we connect to others, and even how we feel things.
And when you speak in another language, especially one you've learned later in life, you're not just switching words, you're switching frames. It's like your mind slips into a slightly different version of itself.
I've heard learners say that speaking English makes them feel calmer. Or more logical. Or more open. Sometimes they feel like they can express emotions in English that they've never said out loud in their own language.
That's so true. And sometimes, English becomes the language of healing. Because it gives you a safe distance from whatever you're carrying. You can explore it with less pressure. Less cultural baggage. Less fear of being judged.
But it also works the other way. I've spoken to people who said English felt cold at first. Too sharp, too direct, like it didn't allow them to express emotion the way their native language does.
Yes, especially when your first language is full of nuance and softness, or when emotional expression is more poetic, more indirect. English can feel a bit blunt in comparison.
But then over time, as you live more of your life in English, the language grows with you. It stops being just foreign, it becomes part of your emotional landscape.
And suddenly, you're not just translating stories anymore, you're creating them. You're making new memories in English. New feelings, new friendships, new chapters.
And maybe that's why stories feel different depending on the language. Because the story isn't just about what happened, it's about who you were at the time, what language you had access to, and how you understood the world.
So when you tell a story in English, it doesn't just sound different, it feels different, because you were different. You were experiencing it through a different lens.
And that's not a bad thing. That's a beautiful thing. It means your story isn't fixed, it's living. It can shift, grow, take on new meaning depending on how you choose to tell it.
Exactly. And in that way, learning English isn't just about new vocabulary, it's about new versions of the truth. Not because you're changing the facts, but because you're seeing them with new eyes.
It kind of reminds me of when you read a book you loved as a child, and then read it again years later. Same story, same words, but it feels completely different because you've changed.
That's such a good comparison. Language works the same way. When you tell a story in English, you're not just using different words, you're bringing a different version of yourself to the story.
And that version might be more reflective. Or more forgiving. Or maybe even more courageous. Because speaking in English gives you that little bit of emotional distance to look back at something with new perspective.
And what's powerful is, that distance doesn't mean detachment. It just means you're able to move through the story rather than get stuck inside it. You can hold it without drowning in it.
And you might find yourself telling the story with a little less shame. Or with more clarity. Or maybe even with a touch of humor, because you've gained enough space to see it differently.
I think that's what makes bilingual storytelling so unique. You don't just translate. You reinterpret. You reframe. You decide how the story lives now, not just how it happened then.
And that's a gift, isn't it? Not everyone gets the chance to tell their story twice, in two languages, with two emotional lenses. That's not just about fluency. That's about depth.
It is. And sometimes I wonder, maybe it's not about which version is more accurate, but which version helps you feel more understood. Which version lets you move forward? Which version feels true in this moment?
Because truth isn't always fixed. Sometimes it changes depending on how we're able to tell it. And language gives us different tools for that, some sharp, some soft, some unfinished.
And maybe that's the whole point. Language isn't just about capturing the past, it's about shaping how we carry it. How we explain it. How we make peace with it.
And that's why your voice in English matters. Even if it's slower, or uncertain, or wrapped in an accent. It still holds truth. It still deserves space.
So if your story feels different in English, that's not a problem. That's a possibility. That's you finding new ways to make sense of your life. New words. New rhythms. A new way forward.
And it's not just deep or serious stories either, is it? Even something simple, like describing a childhood memory or telling a joke, can shift depending on the language.
Yes. Some jokes just don't land the same when you translate them. The humor depends on timing, rhythm, and cultural context. You say it in your native language, people laugh. You try it in English, and silence.
Been there. And the opposite too, moments when I tell a story in English and it surprises even me how funny or light it sounds. Like the language lifts some of the weight off.
Or moments when something comes out softer, gentler. You might say, "It hurt," in English, and that simple sentence carries something clean and honest. In your first language, maybe it would have been more dramatic, or more formal.
Right. English, especially when it's your second language, can simplify things, not in a bad way, but in a way that makes your feelings easier to express.
And I think sometimes, the emotional difference comes from how you learned English. If you learned it through music, movies, or personal stories, the emotional connection is already there.
Yeah, like when someone says they learned English by watching romantic films or listening to love songs. Of course, English is going to feel emotional, it's already tied to stories about longing, heartbreak, tenderness.
And that emotional history gets layered into how you speak. It shapes which words feel warm, which ones feel distant, which ones feel like home.
I love that idea, that your emotional relationship with English isn't about correctness. It's about memory, experience, emotion.
And when you tell your story in English, you're not just speaking differently, you're feeling differently. The words might come slower, but the emotional texture might be richer, or clearer, or even kinder.
And that's something native speakers often don't realize. They think fluency is all about speed and vocabulary. But for a lot of learners, fluency is about feeling safe enough to tell your truth in a second language.
Exactly. Safe enough to tell your story your way, even if the grammar isn't perfect. Even if it takes a bit longer to find the words. The emotional fluency is there.
And that's what matters. That's what gives the story power, not the language itself, but the courage it takes to speak it.
And maybe that's why so many people say, "I don't feel like myself when I speak English." But what they really mean is, "I feel like a different version of myself." Not better, not worse, just different.
Yeah, like discovering a side of you that had been quiet before. Or one that didn't have the words to speak up until now. And English becomes the space where that version can breathe.
I had a student once who said, "In my language, I'm shy. But in English, I speak more freely. I even make jokes." It wasn't because she suddenly became fluent, it was because she gave herself permission to show up differently.
That's such a powerful shift. And it shows that language isn't just about communication, it's about identity. It gives you a way to rewrite not just the story, but the narrator.
And the beauty is, you don't have to choose one version forever. You can carry both. You can tell the story in your first language and feel its weight, and then tell it in English and feel its shape shift, just enough to move forward.
And sometimes that shift is exactly what you need. Not to escape the past, but to reframe it. To soften the edges, to understand it differently, to speak it with more kindness.
Or with more distance. Sometimes the only way to tell a painful truth is to find a language where it hurts, just a little less. Where you can finally say it out loud, not perfectly, but honestly.
And in that honesty, something new opens up. Not just a sentence. A path. A chance to reconnect with who you are now, through a voice you didn't always know you had.
That's why I always tell learners, your accent, your pauses, your word choices, even your mistakes, they all hold emotional meaning. They show how much you've felt, not just how much you've studied.
Yes. Your English voice isn't empty. It's full of courage. It carries your past, your effort, your growth, and your story. Every time you tell it, it becomes more yours.
So when you notice that a story feels different in English, take a moment. Don't see it as a loss. See it as a new layer. A new way to understand yourself and be understood.
Because storytelling in two languages isn't about comparison. It's about expansion. It's not one or the other, it's both. And that's what makes it powerful.
So if you've ever wondered why a memory feels softer, or heavier, or just different when you tell it in English, it's not a flaw. It's a sign that your story is alive. And your language is helping you explore it.
And remember, there's no right or wrong version. Both are true. Both belong to you. And both are part of how you understand who you are.
Thanks for spending this time with us. Whether you're telling your story in your first language, your second, or somewhere in between, keep speaking. Keep discovering. And keep being gentle with your voice.
We're so glad you're here with us, finding meaning through language. This has been the British Accent Podcast.
Until next time.